A female figure moves along the edge of the Calliope Projects just after dark. But something about the walk isn't right. The posture feels off, the shoes don't match the dress, and the wig sits just a little too high on the head. By the time anyone really processes what they're looking at, the figure has already done what it came to do, then disappears into the dark. And even though the people watching could tell it was Meatball in a dress, this is New Orleans. When certain names get attached to certain things, the smart move is to look away and keep your mouth shut. To understand how he held the streets the way he did, you have to understand the place that shaped it all. The B.W. Cooper housing development, better known as the Calliope. It was a massive brick complex stretching across 56 acres and 24 city blocks, with over 1,500 units packed into its grid. In those early years, it wasn't the place people would later fear. It was built for working-class families, a place where you could live decently, save a little money, and maybe move on to something better. The rents were modest, the lawns were kept clean, life had structure. By the time Gennaro Arthur came up in those projects, none of that founding promise had survived intact. What the Calliope had become by the mid-1970s and early 1980s was something else entirely. A dense, overcrowded community where poverty had calcified, opportunity was theoretical, and the drug economy had established itself as the most reliable employer available. Heroin had come through first, sweeping the blocks like a biblical plague, turning the place into a fever dream of nodding out ghosts and broken needles glittering in the gutters. The stories from that era were the kind of raw tabloid nightmares people still whispered about decades later. Mothers in house coats and rollers out on the corner at 3 in the morning, trading their bodies for a $10 bag, whoring themselves raw in the stairwells while their kids waited upstairs. Fathers auctioning off their own children to the corner boys for a week's supply. Little bodies swapped like trading cards so daddy could chase the dragon one more time. Families that had survived the worst of the selling and the whoring now raised their children in the quiet wreckage, where the drug economy had settled in like a permanent landlord, and every kid learned early that softness was a liability. From the time Gennaro Meatball Arthur was born, he was small compared to the other kids around him. Not the kind of presence that commands respect in a project courtyard, where size could mean safety, and the streets taught him that early. He was the kid people picked on, the one who got laughed at, pushed around, overlooked, and in a place like that, being overlooked wasn't just embarrassing, it could get you hurt. Even the name we say so casually today started as a joke. According to a Times-Picayune piece by Michael Pearlstein, the nickname came from a classmate named Charlie Smith, known around the Calliope as Big Charlie C. One day he showed up to school with a messed up haircut, and the reaction was instant. Laughter, loud, unforgiving. Big Charlie C looked at him and said, "Meatball." And just like that, it stuck. What's important about that detail is not the humor of it. It's what it tells you about the engine running underneath. Every slight, every laugh, every dismissal, every moment where his physical smallness became a punchline, fed something inside him. A slow burning resentment, the kind that doesn't announce itself until one day it explodes in a direction nobody anticipated. He wasn't into sports like most of the other kids in the Calliope. He knew early on that path wasn't built for him, too small to stand out, and not interested in playing by systems that never really worked for people around him anyway. While others chased that way out, Gennaro Arthur went the other direction. What he found instead at some point in his teenage years was a 9mm pistol, and once steel touched his palm, everything changed. The world that had been laughing at him suddenly got quieter. He started carrying himself differently. The pistol did what years of existing inside those project walls had not. It gave him the one thing the Calliope made more scarce than money or food or opportunity. It gave him something that looked like power. Meatball wasn't a drug dealer by most accounts. Not in the traditional sense, not a man building a corner, counting kilos, running a supply chain. That distinction matters because it tells you something about what he was actually optimizing for. The kingpin route was about accumulation. Money, product, territory, organization. Meatball's lane was more immediate and more personal than that. What he was, what the streets recognized early, was a jack artist, a robber. He hit dice games. He pressed drug dealers. He caught people slipping and took what they had. It was the most direct possible transaction between violence and respect. Skip the middleman. Skip the operation. Just take what you want from whoever has it, and let the reputation you build in the process become its own form of currency. His catchphrases became legend in the Calliope. He was known for announcing robberies with two particular lines, "Drop it like it's hot," and the one that reportedly froze men solid, "This is a robbery, don't make it a murder." When Meatball said those words, the story goes, Nobody questioned what was going to happen next. Wallets open, pockets emptied, prayers went up fast. The phrase "drop it like it's hot" would later be popularized in hip-hop, but people from that era, from that neighborhood, will tell you without hesitation where it actually came from. From a short, stocky kid from the B.W. Cooper, who used it to announce that he was about to take everything you had and that the choice of whether anyone got hurt in the process was yours to make, not his. According to people who knew him from that era, he was also struggling with drug dependency during this period, something his family and associates have acknowledged. Crack cocaine hit New Orleans in 1987 and turned everything inside out, and Meatball was not immune. The dependency, by the accounts of people close to him, wasn't something he hid or was ashamed of in the way the street code might otherwise demand. It was part of the texture of his daily existence in those years. The using, the need, the escalation of risk that comes when you need more money more consistently and you have only one reliable method for getting it. But what the dependency seemed to do, at least in the streets telling of it, was strip whatever remaining brakes he had off his decision-making. It didn't slow him down, it accelerated him. The more he needed, the more dangerous he became, and the more dangerous he became, the larger the legend grew around him, until the name Meatball started carrying weight in neighborhoods where nobody had personally witnessed anything he'd actually done. The streets were already dangerous when Sam Scully Clay was running things. Clay was a kingpin who had come up through Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, and returned to establish dominance in the Calliope and surrounding projects, distributing product and ruling with the kind of authority that came from reputation built in the harshest possible environment. He had a crew around him, connections that ran deep, and relationships with law enforcement that had allegedly helped insulate certain operations from consequence. A young Meatball, by various accounts, ran in orbits that brought him close to Clay at certain points, close enough that Clay allegedly helped him navigate some early legal problems. Whether that relationship deepened Arthur's trajectory into violence or simply confirmed a path he was already on is difficult to say. What the streets say is that it was Meatball himself who eventually fired the shot that ended Sam Scully Clay's life. That killing, in December of 1987, would become one of the most consequential events in the history of the Calliope Projects, not just because of who died, but because of what his death set in motion. December 1987. Sam Scully Clay was shot and killed at his auto shop. The city barely had time to process it before the power vacuum he left behind began pulling everything into itself. Law enforcement sources, speaking to journalists over the years, have long suspected that members of the emerging Mets organization were involved in Clay's death. Prosecutors acknowledged, however, that they never developed sufficient evidence to charge anyone. The case remains unsolved. The name most commonly whispered on the streets in connection to Clay's murder was Meatballs. But whispers and courtroom evidence are different animals, and in the absence of the latter, that accusation lives only in the former. It's street lore. It's the kind of thing that attaches itself to a man whose reputation has already grown large enough to absorb the weight of it. What is confirmed is what happened next. Glenn Metz and his brother Cordell Jethro Metz moved into the space that Clay's death created. The Metz gang had actually been operating since around 1985, distributing cocaine throughout New Orleans' public housing complexes, maintaining their grip by eliminating anyone who tried to compete. But after Scully went down, the Metz operation expanded its footprint and grew exponentially more violent. Glenn Metz was the face of the organization. His wife, Danielle Bernard Boo Metz, managed the finances, ordering large quantities of cocaine, handling the money laundering, keeping the logistics tight. Sylvester Cat Tolliver served as a lieutenant, and clustered around the hard edge of the organization's operations were three men the federal government would later identify in court documents as gunmen and enforcers: Marlo Lowe Helmstetter, Gerald Knapp Elwood, and Gennaro Meatball Arthur. From 1985 through mid-1992, the Metz organization distributed an estimated 1,000 kilograms of cocaine throughout the New Orleans metropolitan area. That number comes from federal court records, specifically from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decision in United States versus Tolliver, Elwood, Arthur, Helmstetter, and others. 1,000 kilos moved through a network of street-level dealers, coordinated through a leadership structure that would have looked remarkably sophisticated if it weren't built entirely on violence and intimidation. Gerald Elwood, Meatball's partner in enforcement, was famous throughout New Orleans for his customized Ford pickup truck. Armored plating built into the frame, the words "villain" in black painted on the sides and "homicide" emblazoned across the hood. The truck reportedly had no plates. Drug dealers and residents alike knew what it meant when that truck appeared in their neighborhood. Children were called inside. Old people stepped back from their windows. The homicide truck rolling through a block was a message in itself. The Mets organization announcing its presence, reminding everyone who they were dealing with. Court documents and Justice Department reports described the Mets gang as extremely violent in their enforcement of territorial control. Witnesses testified that the enforcers routinely carried AK-47 assault rifles and other automatic weapons. They moved through the city with a kind of brazen confidence that came from knowing that the people who might otherwise report them were more afraid of what would happen afterward than they were interested in justice. Meatball's specific role in this machinery was exactly what his reputation suggested. The certified hitter, not the kingpin, not the corner boss, the man called when a problem needed to be permanently solved. Prosecutors argued at trial that he and his fellow enforcers committed numerous unsolved murders during the late 1980s as part of the gang's campaign of turf control and retaliation. The number that circulated in law enforcement circles and that made its way into UPI news reports at the time of his arrest was 70 bodies. 70 people allegedly killed by Meatball over the course of his career. Court records confirm only a handful of murders. The 70 figure is categorically unproven. It's the kind of number that comes from the intersection of reputation, law enforcement speculation, and a name that had grown so large in the streets that it naturally attracted the gravity of every unsolved killing in the vicinity. But even the handful that were proven was more than enough to send him away for the rest of his life. Then on April 20th, 1990, shortly before dawn, the Airheart Expressway in New Orleans became a war zone. Michael Wilson, Donald Ellis, and Lester L. Dog Duplessis were in a vehicle traveling along the expressway in the eastbound lanes. What happened next was described in detail at trial, corroborated by witness testimony and affirmed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. According to that testimony, Marlo Helmstetter, Gennaro Arthur, and Gerald Elwood were pursuing them in a black Ford Taurus station wagon. A witness named Wilfred Carr testified in his trial version of events that he saw men leaning out of the Taurus with AK-47 assault rifles. The enforcers opened fire. The victim's car was hit with over 150 rounds from automatic weapons, 150 shots fired from men leaning out of a moving station wagon on an elevated expressway just before sunrise. That kind of firepower doesn't happen by accident. It takes planning, coordination, and a clear decision about what's about to happen. This wasn't something that escalated. It was an execution, one that only failed in the sense that not everyone died. Michael Wilson and Donald Ellis were killed. Lester Duplessis survived, but barely. Wilfred Carr was also hit, shots to the ankle, thigh, even one in the backside. Investigators tried to piece it all together from hospital beds and half answers, running into the same problem over and over again. Nobody wanted to talk. The motive came down to street politics and debt. Wilson had switched sides, stopped paying what he owed, and crossed the wrong people. In that world, that's enough to get you marked. Messages between the shooters made it clear. This was about settling a score. As for who did what, that's where things got messy. Some witnesses placed Gennaro Meatball Arthur at the scene, armed with an AK-47. But unlike others, he wasn't clearly identified. His name got tied in through a mix of testimony and circumstantial evidence, the kind that builds a case, but also leaves room for doubt. Duplessis said he saw men jump out of a black station wagon. Carr's story was different. Right after the shooting, in the hospital, he said he couldn't identify anything. The car was too fast. The shooters just shadows. That was his first version. By the time he testified at trial years later, his account had changed substantially. He told the jury that when the shooting stopped, he had looked up and seen both Helmstetter and Arthur leaning from a black Ford Taurus station wagon with automatic weapons in their hands. That contradiction between the original statement and the trial testimony became central to the defense strategy, and it was complicated further by the revelation that the government had paid Carr upward of $20,000 in what was described as security expenses during the trial period. That payment, made to a witness who then provided dramatically different testimony than he had originally given to police, became one of the enduring controversies of the entire case. Arthur's defense argued that the Airheart ambush charges were built on corrupted testimony, that the government had financially incentivized a witness to change his story, and that the identification evidence was insufficient. The jury did not agree. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, reviewing the conviction, affirmed that the evidence established Arthur Elwood and Helmstetter had worked together to kill Michael Wilson and attempt to kill Lester Duplessis as part of the Mets gang's campaign of violence. The Airheart Expressway ambush became the centerpiece of the government's case against Meatball, the act that, more than any other single event, defined the legal argument for why he deserved to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Between the late 1980s and the early 1990s, while federal investigators were quietly building their case, and the NOPD was arresting over 150 gang members and associates across the city, the Mets organization maintained its operations through a combination of product control and something more primal: fear. The Calliope Projects in those years was, by the account of nearly every person who lived through it, a genuine war zone. The Times-Picayune reported that in the decade leading into the early 1990s, the Calliope had seen 88 killings, 88 bodies in the same housing development where children went to school, where grandmothers sat on porches, where families tried to build something resembling a normal life around the escalating violence. The NOPD, by the admission of multiple journalists covering the beat, was attributing 3 out of every 4 murders in the area to drugs, a blunt statistical approach that said more about the department's capacity to investigate than it did about the complexity of what was actually happening on those streets. Into this environment, the Mets enforcers operated with something approaching impunity. Witnesses were the primary obstacle to prosecution, and the organization had a very particular way of managing that obstacle. Court records reference acts of intimidation during the period of the gang's operation, and one specific incident reported by UPI at the time of Arthur's arrest speaks to the method directly. According to those reports, Arthur confronted a government witness, Wilfred Carr, in a housing project and machine-gunned the man in the legs, leaving him as an explicit example to anyone else who might be thinking about cooperating with law enforcement. Carr survived. The message was delivered regardless. That particular allegation, like many surrounding Meatball, sits in a complicated factual space. UPI reported it. Court documents reference intimidation, but the trial record doesn't directly name Arthur in connection to that specific post-Airheart attack on Carr, and so it remains plausible but unproven as a discrete charge. What is not in question is the broader reality. Witnesses in the Mets gang cases were terrified. People who had information chose silence because silence was the only safe option in an environment where the alternative was documented in the scars left on Wilfred Carr's legs. The organization maintained this climate of fear alongside the drug distribution operation with a kind of systematic efficiency that, decades later, would be described in federal indictment language as a continuing criminal enterprise, the legal framework that allowed prosecutors to pursue not just individual crimes, but the organized criminal structure itself. There were moments, according to people who knew Arthur in those years, when the violence penetrated even his own apparent imperviousness to consequence. Family members and associates, speaking to journalists years later, described an incident in the Magnolia Project, the details of which they declined to fully disclose, involving the murder of a young teenager beaten with a baseball bat and set on fire. The killing was not attributed to Arthur in court records or prosecution documents, but according to those accounts, witnessing or learning of what happened to that child shook something loose in him. He couldn't sleep. He started going to church by some accounts, trying to find something outside the world he'd built. The streets that had made him had become something he could no longer fully inhabit without cost. That horror, whatever its precise nature, seems to have accelerated a decision that was already forming in Arthur's mind. Get out of New Orleans, not for a week, not for a month, disappear. The federal machinery had been grinding toward indictment for some time before it arrived. Through mid-1991 and into 1992, law enforcement was working with confidential informants, executing surveillance, running wiretaps, and assembling the evidentiary framework for a continuing criminal enterprise prosecution under federal statute. The case was being built not just against the street-level dealers, but against the entire organizational hierarchy: Glenn Metz, his wife Danielle, the lieutenants, and the enforcers. Arthur learned enough of what was coming to move before the trap closed. By his own account, he had already relocated before the indictment formally dropped. The federal government later characterized his departure as flight from justice, a reading of events that Arthur's people pushed back on, arguing he was already in the process of trying to step away from the life when the system caught up with him. The destination was Seattle, Washington, about as far from New Orleans as you can get while remaining in the continental United States. A city of rain and gray skies, and no immediate cultural context that would connect a 30-something black man from the Louisiana projects to the underworld he was trying to escape. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1990s was its own world entirely. Grunge music coming out of the clubs, a tech industry still in its early formation, a port city culture built on fish markets and coffee shops, and the kind of quiet that New Orleans never has. Nobody in Seattle knew the name Meatball. Nobody in Seattle was carrying the weight of the Calliope, or Sam Scully's execution, or the Airheart Expressway. In Seattle, Gennaro Arthur was just another man. He found work. He found or made a version of ordinary life. According to people who knew him during those Pacific Northwest years, and according to details that emerged in the legal proceedings that followed, he had arrived in Seattle sometime around April of 1992 and had been working at a restaurant since then. He went to church by some accounts. He stayed out of the criminal networks that might have otherwise pulled a man with his history back toward what he knew. The version of the Meatball story that his family and close associates tell, with obvious interest in humanizing him, but also with specific details that ring credible, is of a man who had genuinely reached a point of exhaustion with the life he'd been living, and who had used the distance from New Orleans as an attempt at a kind of reset. Whether that reset would have held, whether Gennaro Arthur would have eventually built something stable in Seattle and stayed there, is a question that the U.S. Marshals made academic on October 28, 1992. The indictment had already dropped. The manhunt was already underway. Arthur's name was on a federal grand jury indictment returned August 14, 1992, and the machinery of the U.S. Marshals Service, which does not stop once it begins, had been working the case. The restaurant was Canlis, one of the most prestigious fine dining establishments in Seattle, a place where the food was expensive and the clientele was well-heeled and the kitchen workers were largely invisible to the people eating upstairs. Gennaro Arthur, the man the streets of New Orleans called Meatball, the man law enforcement had labeled one of the city's most feared enforcers, was washing dishes. There's something in that image that resists easy interpretation. Some see it as proof that he was genuinely trying to leave that life behind. A man who could have stayed armed and dangerous, choosing instead the anonymity of a kitchen job in a city where nobody knew his name. Others see it as the inevitable conclusion of a man who had been fleeing his own history for years before the U.S. Marshals finally showed up to close the distance. Both readings are available. The facts don't force a choice between them. On August 14, 1992, a federal grand jury in New Orleans returned a 22-count indictment against 12 members of the Mets organization. Among the counts were charges under the Violent Crimes in Aid of Racketeering statute, murder and attempted murder, connected to the Airheart Expressway ambush, and other acts of gang violence. Arthur's name was on it. On October 28, 1992, U.S. Marshals arrived at Canlis with a plan. They coordinated with Seattle police and posed as restaurant equipment salespeople, clipboards, fake smiles, the practiced casualness of people pretending to have an ordinary business purpose in the kitchen. They moved through the restaurant until they had Arthur in front of them, standing by a sink, steam rising off the pots around him. Then they moved. They snatched him out of the kitchen before he had time to react. By the following morning, he was in a Seattle courtroom. By the days that followed, extradition proceedings were already in motion to bring him back to Louisiana. A UPI reporter covering the arrest wrote that law enforcement officials described Arthur as believed to have been hiding in Seattle for 2 to 3 years, and that marshals said he was believed to have machine gunned to death 3 people and wounded 2 others in the so-called Airheart Expressway ambush. That's the government's public framing at the moment of arrest. Accusation presented as near certainty, the way these announcements always are made. The trial was still ahead. The evidence would still need to be tested, but in the press and in the street narrative that followed, Meatball's capture in Seattle became another chapter in the legend. The trial of United States versus Tolliver, Elwood, Arthur, Helmstetter, Danielle Metz, and all proceeded in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana. It lasted 3 weeks. More than 100 witnesses testified. The majority of them were, by the court's own acknowledgement, convicted felons already serving time in federal custody, people who had incentives to cooperate with the government and who could be cross-examined on those incentives. The defense used that fact aggressively. The prosecution used the sheer weight of accumulated testimony to counter it. The government's theory was straightforward. From 1985 through mid-1992, this organization conspired to distribute approximately 1,000 kilograms of cocaine throughout the New Orleans metropolitan area. In furtherance of that conspiracy, members committed murders, attempted murders, and other violent crimes. Arthur was not the boss of the organization. Glenn Metz was. Arthur was not the financier. Danielle Metz handled the money. Arthur was the enforcer, one of 3 men whose job it was to protect the organization's interests through the application of lethal violence. The Airheart Expressway ambush was the crown jewel of the prosecution's case against him specifically. They presented the physical evidence, the over 150 rounds recovered from the scene, and the victim's vehicle, consistent with automatic weapons fire. They presented the witness testimony, including Wilford Carr's dramatically revised account of what he claimed to have seen that night. Carr's situation at trial was, by any objective reading, complicated. He had initially told Jefferson Parish Police that he couldn't identify the vehicle or the shooters because everything was moving too fast. By the time he sat in the witness box at federal trial, he testified that he had looked up after the shooting and seen Helmstetter and Arthur leaning from a black Ford Taurus station wagon with weapons in their hands. The government had paid him approximately $20,000 in security expenses during the trial period. That payment and the dramatic shift in his account gave the defense everything it needed to mount a credibility attack. Arthur's defense also argued that he had an alibi for the night of the Airheart shooting, that he was elsewhere, documented through records from a Seattle area organization he had participated in during his time on the West Coast. The legal fight over those documents, whether the government was entitled to them under reciprocal discovery rules, and whether the prosecution had improperly used the discovery process to undermine the alibi and subpoena related witnesses before a grand jury, became the basis of Arthur's subsequent appeals. He argued, in filings after his conviction, that the district court had compelled him to engage in reciprocal discovery in a way that handed the government the very alibi evidence it then turned into a weapon against him. He argued that the grand jury process had been abused. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed those arguments carefully and rejected them. The district court's ruling was not clearly erroneous, the appellate panel found. The door to appeal was locked. On December 22, 1994, the jury returned its verdicts. Guilty. Guilty across the board. Murder and attempted murder under the Violent Crimes in Aid of Racketeering statute. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Use of firearms in connection with drug trafficking crimes. The weapons charges alone carried significant additional time. Arthur had been connected at trial not just to the Airheart ambush, but to a vehicle chase during which law enforcement recovered a loaded Mac 11 and a loaded Mini 14, both found in his possession. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole, plus additional years for the firearms convictions. 8 people in total were convicted in the 22-count indictment. Glenn Metz received life. Danielle Metz, who had managed the finances of the entire operation and had been found in January 1993 after U.S. Marshals followed a trail of tips through rural Mississippi, received triple life plus 20 years at her separate December 1993 sentencing. In 2016, President Barack Obama commuted Danielle Metz's sentence as part of his clemency initiative addressing the sentencing disparities of the crack era. Her release drew renewed media attention to the entire Metz case. Gerald Elwood received 3 concurrent life sentences plus 30 years and is currently incarcerated at FCI Coleman in Florida. Gennaro Arthur's sentence was never commuted. His appeals were exhausted. The machine that had been built to prosecute the Metz organization rolled over him and left him buried inside it. Florence, Colorado sits in Fremont County, about 100 miles south of Denver, at the foot of the Wet Mountains. It's a quiet town in the objective sense of the word. Small population, unremarkable geography, the kind of place that doesn't appear in most people's mental maps of the country. But Florence is where the federal government built the Administrative Maximum Facility. ADX Florence, known in the incarcerated world simply as Supermax. ADX Florence opened in 1994. It is the highest security federal prison in the United States, designed specifically to house individuals deemed too violent, too predatory, too escape-prone, or too organizationally influential to exist within the general population of regular federal penitentiaries. The architecture of the place is engineered around isolation. Inmates typically spend 22 to 23 hours a day in single occupancy cells. Human contact is minimized by design. The cells are small, poured concrete, and the facility sits in the landscape like something that wasn't meant to be found. The Federal Bureau of Prisons Inmate Locator, as of 2026, lists Gennaro Arthur under register number 22957, 086, currently housed at Florence AD Max, USP. Age 61. Release date, life. More than 90% of ADX, Florence's inmates arrived there after already being in the federal prison system, transferred because of their behavior after conviction, not simply because of what they did on the streets. You don't get sent to Supermax for the crime that put you in prison. You get sent to Supermax because of what you did once you were already locked up. The institution is populated by people who make other federal prisons ungovernable, people who have organized violence from inside, who have attempted escapes, who have killed other inmates, who the Bureau of Prisons has determined cannot safely be held anywhere else. Gennaro Meatball Arthur checks every relevant box on that determination. The man who moved through the Calliope Projects in the late 1980s and early 1990s with an AK-47 who prosecutors said helped machine gun a vehicle on an elevated expressway until it had absorbed more than 150 rounds, who allegedly shot a witness in the legs to keep him from testifying. That man is now inside the facility that America reserves for its most intractable federal prisoners. He will not leave while breathing. The cross-dressing story has taken on a life completely independent of whatever actually happened. C. Murder referenced it in a verse, putting Meatball in a wig and naming him explicitly, weaving the legend into rap history the way New Orleans artists always have, turning the street into lyric. Juvenile name-checked Meatball in lyrics that touched on his street reputation. Master P mentioned him in Ghetto Heroes and in Jackets for Beasts, dropping his name into the canon of New Orleans dangerous men the way you might cite a historical figure, not as a warning exactly, but as a marker of the era's temperature. Manny Fresh put his name alongside Glenn Metz's in a song. Multiple New Orleans-based content creators have built entire video essays around the legend, hundreds of thousands of views each, comment sections full of people from the city who grew up hearing his name and treating it like a given fact of New Orleans history. The cross-dressing assassin has become so embedded in the oral history of uptown New Orleans that separating the factual core from the accumulated mythology has become nearly impossible for anyone who wasn't there. And here's the thing about legends that get this large. They serve a function. The myth of Meatball, the ghost in a dress, the man who could make himself invisible by becoming someone the streets didn't expect, the hitman who operated outside the ordinary logic of how violence worked. That myth said something specific about what the Calliope was in those years. It said that danger could be anywhere, wearing any face, arriving in any form. It said that the normal rules of threat assessment didn't apply. It created a kind of ambient terror that served the organizational interests of the Mets gang, whether or not Meatball himself ever put on a single item of women's clothing for any purpose beyond a Halloween joke in somebody's courtyard. Fear, weaponized at scale, is its own form of infrastructure, and a legend like Meatball's was a load-bearing wall in the architecture of that fear. A family member of Arthur's, speaking anonymously to journalists, offered the most grounded account of where that particular story came from. Around Halloween, sometime during the Mets gang era, Meatball and a few of his friends dressed in women's clothing, wigs, dresses, the whole setup. It was a joke. They were in someone's courtyard. They also had guns on them, because having guns was simply a constant of daily existence for men in their position. Someone saw it or heard about it, and the story got told. Then it got retold. Then it became Meatball used to dress as a woman to get close to his targets and take them out. Then Juvenile put it in a verse. Then it became documented street history. That's the full pipeline, from a Halloween costume in a courtyard to a documented characteristic of a notorious New Orleans hitman, carried forward through decades by the particular engines of street oral tradition and hip-hop reference. That same family member was careful to note, and this is worth sitting with, that Meatball was not innocent of many things. The qualifier wasn't he didn't do any of this. The qualifier was a lot of what got put on him wasn't his. In a world where a man's name becomes large enough to attract the gravity of every unsolved crime in a given area, where simply being the person known for putting in work means your name gets attached to hits you had nothing to do with, the mythology can swell far beyond the reality. 70 bodies is almost certainly not the accurate count. The court proved a handful. The rest belongs to the legend, not the record. And the legend, unlike the record, has no burden of proof. What the record does confirm is this. Gennaro Arthur was an enforcer for a violent cocaine distribution organization that moved 1,000 kilograms of cocaine through New Orleans and committed murders in furtherance of its operations. He was convicted by a federal jury of murder and attempted murder under the Vicar statutes, of conspiracy to distribute cocaine, and of firearms offenses. His conviction was affirmed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Every appeal he filed was denied. He has been in federal custody since his arrest in Seattle in October 1992, over 30 years, and he will remain there for the rest of his life inside the most restrictive federal prison in the country. The myth says Meatball was a ghost who walked through enemy territory in women's clothing and left bodies behind like punctuation marks. The myth says he killed 70 people. The myth says his name was so large that the entire city lived in the shadow of it. The reality says a small kid from the Calliope Projects, ridiculed for his size and his haircut, found a 9mm pistol and used violence to manufacture the respect that the world had denied him. The reality says he became part of a drug organization that poisoned the city and killed people who got in its way. The reality says he was caught washing dishes in a restaurant in Seattle, brought back to Louisiana in handcuffs, tried before a jury, convicted and sentenced to die in prison. Both versions are true in their respective registers. The myth tells you something real about what the streets needed Meatball to be. A figure of almost supernatural menace, someone who could move through a hostile world invisible, strike without warning, and disappear before the smoke cleared. That image served a purpose. It communicated something about the stakes of that time and place. The Calliope, in the late 1980s, a housing project bleeding out from 88 killings in 10 years. A city that had become in some corners indistinguishable from an active war zone. The reality tells you what actually happens to men who build their whole identity on the capacity for violence in a world where the federal government has infinite time and resources and patience. It tells you that the legend doesn't protect you from a grand jury indictment. It tells you that a reputation built on fear becomes worthless the moment the U.S. Marshals walk through the kitchen door, somewhere in Florence, Colorado, inside a cell that measures 9 feet by 7 feet, with concrete walls and a steel door and a window sized to admit light but not sky. Gennaro Meatball Arthur, register number 22957, 086, age 61, release date, life, exists inside the distance between those two versions of himself. The myth kept growing after the door closed behind him. New rappers referenced him. New YouTube documentaries placed him at the center of New Orleans underground history. His name circulated in conversations about the city's most feared figures, alongside legends from other eras and other blocks. He's not in those conversations. He's in a room in Colorado where the weight of what he did and what he became and what was laid at his feet, regardless of whether he did it or not, presses down on him in the particular silence of a place designed to make a man disappear while he's still breathing. The lady in the dress and the sneakers, the figure moving wrong in the New Orleans dark. Whether that image captures something real or something the streets needed to believe, it doesn't much matter anymore. What it captured, more than anything, was the particular way a legend grows to fill the empty space left by a man who isn't there anymore, to contradict it. Meatball left New Orleans. The myth of Meatball stayed.